How's it going, everyone? Got a video. Like I said, we're back on the RX-7, and we've got quite a bit of stuff here that we're going to be playing with today. So all of this stuff, this is a wideband setup. All of this stuff belongs in my blue Turbo Civic, but for the time being, I pulled it out just because I want to be able to keep it in this car for a little while, but not permanently. So those wideband setups are like, at the time anyways, they used to be like $200. So putting them in every single vehicle I have doesn't really make sense. So the most important one at the time gets the one that, gets the wideband setup that it needs. And then when I need it in another vehicle, I'll switch it back over. So out of these two, I would say the Civic definitely needs it the most at all times. So this belongs in that car. But we just rejetted the carburetor in the last video, so I want to be able to check it out on the road, make sure everything is good as can be, and I just definitely want that to make sure. So we're going to put that in the car today. I've already done some of the heavy work ahead of time, so now installing this will be a lot easier. When I built the exhaust system for this car, I knew that I wanted to eventually be able to put a wideband setup on it. So it may be hard to see, but I've got block hugger headers here, and then they go from a 4 into a 1 collector, and then it runs in a 2.5-inch pipe. And right here, I welded on an O2 sensor bung. If we come over here, it's just a little nut, but it's threaded for an O2 sensor. And then, so I welded this onto that pipe. I put the sensor in it and then just ran it on top of the intake manifold. And when you don't have a sensor in it, you can just run one of these plugs and they'll just thread in. And it also has a little gasket on it too. Put some sealant on it just to make sure that it doesn't leak. But being that this is already done, and we already have the sensor wire ran to the back of the distributor, we can just tap into it through the firewall. So basically everything that we need to do outside the car is already done. If you don't want to do the weld-on method, which is what I definitely recommend, just take a drill bit, drill a hole in the exhaust somewhere, make sure it's big enough for the O2 sensor, weld this nut on. That's the best method. Another method that they have that I've seen is you drill the hole in the exhaust pipe, but then you have, it's kind of like another half of an exhaust pipe with this bung already welded into it. So all you have to do is basically just clamp it around the exhaust, and that way you don't have to weld anything. But if you're in the position to weld, I definitely recommend this method. Just because even if you're only using it temporary, or when you're building your exhaust or getting your exhaust built, I would ask for them to put this in somewhere just so that if you ever want to, it's there, no big deal. But being that's all done under the hood, we have our wire for our gauge from our controller. We got our controller, we got our gauge. This harness here is for your O2 sensor, so you gotta make sure you get the O2 sensor that matches this plug. This will plug into the controller, and then you've got your power constant, your power switched, and your ground here, and this also will plug into the controller. So we just got to mount this somewhere, run to the O2 sensor, we've got to run from the controller to the gauge, and then we've got to give power from the controller to the car so that it can operate whenever you turn your car on. Here we are in the car. I've got a pretty organized setup down here that makes doing wiring very simple, especially while in the car. So I got the power wire harness for the controller, and in this instance, just to make things a little bit easier, I connected the constant power source and the switched power source together. And what I'm going to do and then I'm gonna ground it obviously, and I'll give this constant power. And whenever I don't want the wideband setup on, I'm just gonna unplug this from the controller. So when I go somewhere, and if I'm only planning on being out of the car for a little bit, just that gauge being on isn't gonna hurt anything. But if you plan on being out of the car for a long period of time, you can just unplug this from the controller and you won't have to worry about anything. So I'm gonna pull this off, and then I know exactly where I'm gonna get my power and ground from. So we gotta just grab a Phillips head screwdriver, and we should be able to hook this power wire up. So that's that. We got our constant power and our switched power connected together, and those are just going to the output on this fuse box. It's just a constant source, it doesn't go anywhere. And then our ground also connected to our grounding bus bar. Now that we got this done, we can just neatly route this to wherever we're going to put the controller. There's a bracket up here. I know you guys can't see it, but we will probably zip tie the controller to that for the time being. I think that'll work just fine. Before mounting that controller, what I'm actually going to do is run the harness for the O2 sensor through the firewall. Once we hook this harness up to the controller, it'll be a lot easier to mount the controller because the zip ties will have something to kind of wrap around. So I'm gonna go out into the engine bay and we'll just run this through that hole over there, and that should be just fine. Now that the O2 sensor wire is ran through, we're gonna hook everything up to the controller, and then once we get everything mounted to the controller in terms of the wiring, we'll coil it up neatly, put it under the dash, and then we can run our wires to wherever they need to go. So like the gauge, we still gotta figure out where the gauge is gonna go. Haven't quite figured that one out yet, but everything else has basically, it just makes sense to coil it all together. So I guess I'll do that now, and then I'll get back with you guys. There it all is. Everything is wired up, zip tied up, out of the way. I still gotta figure out where I wanna put that gauge. I used to have like little pods that you could like double-sided tape to whatever you wanted, and then just run your wire to the gauge, but I can't find those. It's been a little bit now, and I found this clamp and this piece together that came with my coilovers. Now this wraps around the strut body, and then there's this little clip here, and then your brake line goes in this. I didn't have factory brake lines that I could utilize this for, so it just made sense to remove this because this wasn't gonna work for me. But now I actually come up with a solution to mount the gauge. So we'll tighten that up real quick. And it'll put it actually in quite a bit of a better location. If you take the gauge and this ring, there's some slack, and it definitely won't hold itself in. So my plan is to take some electrical tape, and we're going to wrap it around this gauge until we get the correct fit. So this may take a little bit just to get it right. You don't want to overdo it, and if you underdo it, it's definitely not going to fit. So just wrap this around this a little bit. Now that we've got this in here, I'm gonna tighten this Allen head bolt and nut up, just so this isn't all loosey-goosey, just so I can move it a little bit. But the place that I wanna put it in the car, this should be perfect. So I'm gonna go grab a adjustable real quick. Just a little snug, and we'll jump in the car. I'm not sure how well you guys can see it. Got Finn over there by you guys. But we're going to loosen this nut that is used to mount the steering wheel to the column. And then what we'll do is we'll put this piece here underneath the bolt and then tighten, between the bolt and the nut. Then we'll tighten the nut down, and it should hold the gauge right there. I think it'll look awesome. And then we can just run the wiring behind the dashboard and plug it in. There we are. Now that the gauge is mounted, we'll run the wire up under the dash here. Everything's all wired up now. All the wires are tucked. And if I come back here, turn on the main power, we should have gauge power. So, like I said, whenever you want to shut that gauge off, if you're going to be parking the car for a long period of time, you can just unplug it from the back, or you can unplug it from the controller. It doesn't really bother me either way. Whenever I drive the car, I go do what I'm doing, and then I use the car, say I go to the store or whatever, and then I come back, and then I shut the car off and put it in its parking spot, and I'll even hit the kill switch. So it's not super important to me, but there's plenty of outputs down there, and especially in your car as well, any car that has a fuse panel. Usually cigarette lighters are just ignition power, so you can just tap in to those and you should be just fine, and you'll have a gauge that works every time. Like in a traditional car, when you put your key on, you want everything else to turn on with your gauges, like your radio and stuff like that. So just make sure that you tap in your switched power to something that gets power when your ignition is turned on, and your gauge will work like normal. Like I said, this is temporary, it comes in and out of the car, so just having those wire leads twisted together and then tapped in to the relay board is just easy for me. So that's gonna do it for this video. That's how to install a wideband setup. It's pretty easy. The thing that's probably the most difficult is doing, like if you're welding on a bung for your O2 sensor to thread into. Luckily, I already did that before in the exhaust and put the sensor in it, just so I didn't have to worry about doing that when the time comes to installing the wideband. So stay tuned for next video. What we're going to be doing is putting battery tenders, I've got it right here, and wiring them in the cars permanently. I've got two, one for each of my non-driven cars really. So the RX-7, we'll get one, we'll hardwire that, and we'll figure out the best place to have the extension cord run into the car to charge the battery. And then we're gonna do the same thing on my Civic. And we also bought a new battery for it as well, just because that one that's in there is old, and I literally have to jump start the car every single time that I want to move it or air it up or whatever, because it's always dead. So I think something with that battery is internally messed up. So new one, Walmart battery, it's like $100. It's got like a warranty or whatever on it. That'll be the video that comes out in 3 days, so stay tuned for that. It's a good little thing to have on any of your cars, especially in the Northeast where you're not driving them all the time. Just have a little battery tender set up to keep the batteries topped off, and then that way you hopefully won't have the issue that I have on my Civic, where I've got a dead battery that you just can't recharge. In the meantime, stay on the lookout for my YouTube shorts. Those come out every single night. It ranges from anything. It could be content on my Civic. It could be content on the RX-7. It could be drifting content, burnouts, idling clips. I love listening to this RX-7 idle, so I've got a lot of those. But those come out anywhere between like 7:30, 8 o'clock, or all the way till 10 p.m. So just stay tuned. It's always something you can check out too in the morning. But that's gonna do it for this video. And that's how you install a wideband setup. So I'll see you guys in 3 days.